Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to another comics and lit mind mapping video. The last one was successful, so I thought we'd have another crack at it, looking at another aspect of Macbeth. And today we're going to look at a kind of character focus. I'm going to focus on Macbeth. I'm going to focus on Macbeth's tragic downfall. So I'm going to start that here, and I'll show you why I'm starting a bit lower in a minute. So let's write that in as our kind of key heading. Macbeth's tragic. Let's put that below. And below downfall. And this, of course, links to the main sort of genre of the play. Of course, it's a tragedy. And so when we look at Macbeth's character, we're going to look at him as having his kind of downfall, like rising up to a position of power and then falling down. So what I think is quite nice to do here is I'm going to sort of draw it up as a kind of visual way, as a kind of mountain peak and then sort of falling back down again. So if we imagine the peak of the mountain to be the crown, essentially, Macbeth becoming king. So the beginning of the play, leading up the mountain to success, and then of course as we move towards the play's third, fourth, and fifth acts, his sort of slow descent into ruin. That happens, of course, over the play. And we're going to be looking out for a sort of a few key features. But the first one I kind of wanted you to think about, and I'll put it in brackets here, this idea of hamartia, which is a Greek word. It comes from Greek, and it's links to the idea of a Greek tragedy. I'm going to write that down there. Greek tragedy. You can do the kind of mask face if you want. Looks more like a ghost, but you get the idea. Sort of hamartia links to the idea of Greek tragedy, and this means a fatal flaw. So the reason I'm writing this here is this is kind of key to the idea of the downfall. So when we look at Shakespearean tragedies, and Shakespeare, of course, got a lot of his ideas from the Greek tragedies, and this Greek word hamartia, it basically means a fatal flaw, which is the problem with the main character. So in any traditional tragedy, there is a problem that the main character has, which leads them to, of course, make mistakes as the play goes on, and that kind of leads to this kind of downfall element. What kind of makes them lose everything? Some tragedies end in the death of the main character. Other tragedies focus on them losing things that are precious to them, like partners or positions in society. And of course, Macbeth actually loses his life at the end of the play. So as we link through character quotes, we're going to keep linking back perhaps to this idea of a hamartia, a fatal flaw, and what it is that kind of draws Macbeth to make poor choices in the play. Now, you all probably know, if you've studied the play at all before, like the main kind of issue for Macbeth is ambition, which of course we did a mind mapping series on not long ago. So I might just put that in a kind of thought bubble here as the kind of flaw. Maybe I should label it as well to remind myself. So the fancy word is hamartia, but we can see that as a fatal flaw as we look through the play as a whole. So let's get going. We're going to look kind of at events in order, and I'm going to map them around this kind of mountaintop, hopefully roughly in order of how they occur in the play. So let's start at the very beginning of the play. We'll again begin with the witches, which is quite how I started the last one, but I think it's so kind of critical. I'm going to put that right here. So, of course, Act 1, Scene 1. It is the witches' prophecies. Let's draw the kind of three witches' hats, which is my kind of symbol for the weird sisters. And, of course, their prophecy to Macbeth is, all hail Macbeth, that shalt be king. And that's going to be our first quote to look at. Now, this quote is about Macbeth. The witches predict that he will become king. You draw a little crown there, and that's a sort of prophecy about the future. So leading forward, Macbeth is going to become the king. They, of course, say this to Macbeth, and it's a surprise to him. So it's basically what we call, and I think I noted this down in the last one as well, an inciting incident. I'll give that capitals. And that basically means the moment in any kind of story which kind of kicks off the action. Draw a little lightning bolt as well. The minute that sort of starts the action and leads the character onto their path and journey. So that is our kind of beginning to the play, and that's what kind of tempts Macbeth as well to make some of the poor decisions that lead to his tragic downfall. And we could say sort of unlocks Macbeth's inner evil. So that's kind of the first kind of key moment to focus on there, the Act 1, Scene 1, the prophecy from the witches. Let's move forward. So Macbeth's response to the witches is quite telling as we're moving through to the play. So once the witches have disappeared and Macbeth gets some time alone, this is what Macbeth says. This supernatural, and the word supernatural refers to anything that has to do with ghosts or apparitions or strange events. Soliciting. I like to just sort of supernatural soliciting means unnatural news or ghostly news, if you like. And he then says, cannot be good, which kind of implies he is somewhat suspicious of what the witches have said. Oh, I'm sorry, I've just realised I made a mistake. Let's get rid of that. Starts with cannot be ill. So actually his first response is to say it cannot be bad, cannot be ill. So in Shakespearean, ill means bad. And then he says cannot be good. Excuse my mistake. And what we've got here is Macbeth's kind of one of Macbeth's first responses to the witches. And it's interesting that he uses here an oxymoron. Remember oxymoron, the use of opposites in literature. So we've got ill and good, and those are contrasting. And this generally implies confusion or suggests confusion, which again links to this idea of witchcraft, but the idea that Macbeth doesn't know whether to trust what the witches are saying to him or not, but he is intrigued. And I think it's quite telling here, cannot be ill is his first sort of statement, that he seems potentially excited or eager to find out more. So we might have Macbeth here eager to find out more. But the oxymoron kind of expresses his doubt or concern as well. Tellingly, though, it only takes slightly later on before Macbeth, in that same sort of soliloquy, is mentioning a horrid image in his head, and we could sort of draw it up. See if I can kind of do it. So just do it quite a simple sort of concern inside his head. I believe, and most readers would sort of agree, sort of seeing sort of a deathly murder, or the idea of potential for murder is inside his head already. So you can see at the start of the play, moving up to this point of becoming a king, Macbeth already begins thinking over or wondering whether he can commit murder. Moving forward to Act 1, Scene 7. A few things have happened in the interim, of course. Macbeth has found out that Malcolm has been made Prince of Cumberland. He's already sort of had some dark and evil thoughts at that time. Lady Macbeth has found out about the prophecies and is excited and tries to convince Macbeth to go through the murder. And through to Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth, we find, is still sort of doubting or wondering whether he can go through with it. And another line which I used in a previous video is this one. And I think it's important with this idea of his character here as well, and the idea of downfall. He says, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. So intent means his will or his desire, but only vaulting ambition. So there's that key word again, ambition. So the mention of the hamartia, I'm just going to put H, that could be my kind of symbol for hamartia here. And he says he has no spur to prick the sides of his intent. Again, we talked about this another time, but I'll quickly draw it up. So a spur is a kind of spike on the edge of a horse riding boot. So here we have a kind of metaphor, and what he's basically saying is he doesn't have the strength of will. The spur is his strength of will. And he's saying he doesn't have enough will to fire up his intent to kill Duncan. So a sense here that ambition is not enough. Should label that as a metaphor. So we can get our kind of AO2 marks for analysis of literary devices. Here, so ambition is not enough. We need something more. And in this kind of metaphor, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition. And he's basically saying his ambition is going too far here. Vaulting means to jump. So this kind of metaphor, again, expressing that he's going too far in simple language. So at this point in the journey, we could sort of picture Macbeth sort of here on the hilltop of his ambition to be crowned. Maybe a little higher, actually. Let's put him there, kind of hiking up the mountain of his ambition, but kind of questioning at this point whether or not it's worth it, or is he even brave enough to do it. Now, moving forward, looking at stick on the same scene and look at how it actually ends up convincing him. So let's sort of just line that off and look at Act 1, Scene 7 later on, as he argues with Lady Macbeth over whether to go through with it. And so let's look at a quote from Lady Macbeth. Just going to put a Lady M just for speed. And of course, one of a commonly used one here. She says to him, "When you durst do it." And by it, she means the murder. When you said you would do it, then you were a man. And this is a commonly chosen quote for analysis because it's then you were a man. Keyword there is man. And of course, this is linking to ideas of masculinity. Lady Macbeth uses sort of shame to kind of convince Macbeth to go through with the murder. So we've got a kind of, it's good to look at like maybe tone here. Lady Macbeth is disdainful, which means like full of just kind of mocking him, or she thinks he's worthless. We could probably put mocking there as well. And that is like kind of another kind of shocking point. Again, I've probably put a little lightning bolt here. It's another key moment in the play which kind of pushes Macbeth towards this rise to power when he may otherwise not have been able to do it. So of course we've got the key context as well, the idea of masculinity and femininity, of course, for Lady Macbeth. Here very much forcing Macbeth's hand and showing her own power. So Lady Macbeth we can analyse as a key kind of part of Macbeth's tragic downfall, what leads, and in a way this hamartia kind of comes through both of them, like her ambition as well combines with his, which is pushing them over the edge. And as we're getting very close to the rising to the top, we move forward. Let's take to the top of the map here, and we'll look at Act 2, Scene 1. And of course the dagger. And the reason I think this is relevant, let's draw it up. So at this point, Macbeth sees this kind of floating apparition of a dagger, kind of covered in blood. Let's do some wavy lines, and of course there's a question over, is it the witches? Put a question mark here. Are they driving him as well towards doing this murder? And the quote here is, "This a dagger which I see before me." Is this a dagger? Should we do the full quote? Yeah, go on then. Is this a dagger which I see before me? So we've got kind of two elements that push Macbeth towards this crime. Both his wife, Lady Macbeth, sort of in her mocking and disdain, and then the potential for ghostly or witchcraft as an intervention here, the dagger. So there's a question around this one, whether it's actually Macbeth's conscience or murderous thoughts leading into the murder, or is it the witches kind of manipulating him? So the dagger is a symbol, which is our kind of technique or device. Let's put it in a box. Symbol of violence. It's being used there to kind of show his violent thoughts, but also links to the idea of witchcraft as well. So is it being used or manipulated there? And probably worth noting as well the idea of the visual element to it. We've got gouts of blood, which is also a quotation. The dagger is covered in gouts of blood, which again links to the idea of violence and it's almost a foreshadowing of the murder that's going to happen. So here we go. So these events lead to Duncan's murder. Let's put that just as a reference point. Again, I'll sort of just draw up poor old Duncan. There he is. Duncan is murdered. And that happens between Act 2, Scene 1 and 2. And of course, as Macbeth is about to ascend to the throne, I have to sort of squeeze this in, we get a huge sense of regret over what he's done. And Macbeth's first response is to show an absolute aching sense of sorrow. So let's kind of look at Macbeth. And the result of the murder is a complete sense of guilt and sorrow over what he's done. And Macbeth asks, will all great Neptunes capital letter for Neptune, because it's a Roman god, ocean, wash this blood. Clean from my hand. This one here, we've got the theme of guilt. So Macbeth's first response here is guilt as he's sort of getting closer to the crown. He's murdered Duncan, not quite king yet, but it's this sort of sense of guilt that hangs over his head. What have I done? And he questions here. So let's put that kind of key as a question. How can his guilt be cleaned? And he uses this quite... we could first organise a kind of a hyperbole. So the fact that he's exaggerating all of Neptune's ocean, so using gods as using kind of gods as a metaphor. For his sin, as it were, so kind of a nice link to the kind of idea of God or the crime against God. Shakespeare likes his Roman and Greek allusions, likes to show his knowledge of great mythology, and it emphasizes the depth of his sin. His sin is like an ocean. And we could, of course, reference as well the blood as a symbol of violence and guilt here as well. Okay, now here he becomes king, and this is kind of where I want to sort of focus on this bit at the top of the mountain. I've sort of had to squeeze it in here, but then as soon as he reaches the point, he gets crowned king, despite the suspicion of some of the other thanes, and pretty quickly things start to unravel. So he reaches the very top, and of course his ambition doesn't end. It's not good enough, and Shakespeare shows us that Macbeth is not the chosen king, he's not the true king, and therefore his ambition is kind of corrupted, and he starts making very poor choices at this point. And I'd like to point out this kind of idea of jealousy that comes in as Macbeth starts to question all those around him. And that's the first thing he does, is question Banquo's loyalty. I'll just quickly remind myself which scene that is. So, of course, Act 3, Scene 1, Macbeth starts to question sort of Banquo's place or loyalty, even, or even the witch's prophecies over Banquo. So he comments that first they hailed him, and he means Banquo, father to a line of kings. And this infuriates Macbeth. So we've got a tone infuriated. He cannot handle the idea that he can't pass the throne on to his own children. So we've got this idea of jealousy and rivalry. And it's going to lead Macbeth to obviously have Banquo murdered. And this is what I like to say the hinge point of the play. And I could even label that here a hinge point. So it's where things start to turn. Like the idea when he decides to have Banquo murdered, he starts to lose his own sense of power or even humanity. And this is kind of often seen as a turning point in the play, or a hinge point. We could say turning point as our feature. And after this point, it really starts to go wrong for Macbeth, and that's where the downfall element comes. So, killing Banquo. He has Banquo murdered, and all of the things that happen after that, we've got obviously Banquo's ghost. Could just draw a sort of cartoony ghost here. Banquo's ghost. Haunts Macbeth. Again, which is a sort of symbol of guilt and a conscience. Could link to this idea of guilt within the play. Again, leading to his lack of good judgment. And this immediately inspires him to return to the Weird Sisters. And of course, in Act 4, Scene 1, he returns to the Weird Sisters. And there's this lovely line that the Weird Sisters say when he approaches by the pricking of my thumbs. Something wicked this way comes. So it's kind of one of the most famous lines from the play, and you could draw up the kind of thumb with the needle on it. So you've got this again, this idea of blood. So it's a terrible drawing there. Let's draw a kind of thumb and blood on it, and it's a sign of wickedness. So again, they're referencing sort of motif of blood. Motif is a repeating symbol. Several motifs in Macbeth, including blood, weaponry. Could argue the witches themselves are a motif, a sort of repeated symbol of evil or wickedness. Nature as well, but we come back to it another time. But this motif of blood again repeated to show sort of Macbeth's wickedness, or the change in Macbeth. And we can debate within our essays whether that's come about through witchcraft, through poor decisions, through his own agency. But we've got a kind of character change. Remember, you can analyse that as a technique or feature, how characters change, why writers do that. And essentially, Star Wars kind of reference, Macbeth has gone over to the dark side now, choosing to return to the witches. So this time, it's a choice to return. Whereas earlier on, we could just label that back on the early stages, wherever the witches I put. It is accident, or not his choice, argue. So this move from him actually choosing witchcraft, and let's again put my witches hats there to reference that. So we're almost done. I wanted to sort of put in a couple other points, but just time-wise, I'm just going to reference this verbally, but the idea that not just the murder of Banquo, but later he has Macduff's family murdered as well, and that comes about through the apparitions that the witches send and he's trying to have Macduff murdered, but Macduff has fled to England. So instead, the family get murdered. Lady Macduff, Macduff's son, and presumably anyone else. And this again, this sense of wickedness, this evil act again from Macbeth, sort of saying the change of his character from kind of noble to evil, is very telling at this point of the play. So two more short things to just reference. Once the play moves into Act 5, key moments, of course, Lady Macbeth losing her mind. Then, of course, it pushes forward to Act 5, Scene 5, as the castle is under siege. Macbeth finds out Lady Macbeth has died, presumably through suicide. And, of course, we have this kind of desperate soliloquy made by Macbeth, where he utters like life's but a walking shadow. I quite like to analyse this as a connection to emptiness. It is, of course, a metaphor. So he's comparing life to a shadow. And he ends up saying it signifying nothing. So the result of all of this ambition, the result of his hamartia and his ambition, is that he believes life is empty. We've got shadow, we've got connotations, darkness, lack of purpose. Perhaps you won't be able to read that, but lack of purpose and darkness connotes by the shadow. So it's a powerful metaphor expressing a sense of emptiness, partly due to Lady Macbeth dying, presumably, but also the fact that he knows he's about to die, and has no hope left. So following that, of course, Macbeth is killed. You could just sort of Macduff. There we often picture him with an axe. So let's sort of draw Macduff. There we go. Macduff kills Macbeth. So Macbeth is killed. Again, I won't reference the quote, but I love that line, "Turn, hellhound, turn," as Macduff asks him, "Look upon thy death." And Macbeth is killed at the end of the play, which of course links to this idea of a downfall. So we reference that there. So there's your tragic downfall, the honourable warrior, the good servant of the king, rises to power, and then through a series of poor choices, crimes against God and humanity, he falls down and is murdered and shamed. And of course, the final line, in the final lines of the play, as Malcolm is crowned, he references, he's not crowned, sorry. Malcolm is victorious. He says he's going to be crowned, but he isn't crowned. So Malcolm is going to be crowned, and he describes Macbeth as a dead butcher, which I think is another excellent metaphor to look at. Of course, Macbeth not literally a butcher. He again, we're linking to this idea of violence, lack of control. The idea links to death. Obviously, the idea of butchers. Not a real king, it's an insult. And it's let's get that right, insult. And the idea of shame. So the expression of Macbeth is simply a violent man with no control. And the idea of cruelty expressed by that idea of a butcher, someone who just kills people. So at the end of the play, the great chain of being is restored. Malcolm is the rightful heir to the throne, as named by Duncan, and Macbeth is simply a dead butcher. I didn't write it earlier on. I probably could have added the quote in For example, brave Macbeth, which is what Duncan says, or valiant cousin, worthy gentleman at the start. Maybe I could quickly. There's no space for it, but I might add those quotes in if I were to do this again, and then all through the plot points of the play, eventually ends up as a dead butcher, having lost everything. So there we go. So a fairly quick, simple mind map exploring quotations linking to Macbeth's tragic downfall over the play. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, I love feedback. So any comments in the comments bar, please subscribe to the channel. Help support me producing new content, and of course, give me a like and recommend me to anyone else if you think this content is helpful. Thank you for watching.